The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. Some good news to tell you about today. Two actually positive stories. We'll start with the new House Oversight Committee investigation into the Georgia voter suppression allegations. This was hugely controversial in the November midterms, where Stacey Abrams, the first Black American major party candidate for the Georgia governorship, lost under the cloud of suspicion of very significant voter suppression that was going on for a very long time. You had Brian Kemp, the state's new governor, then attorney general. Was he actually? No, I'm sorry. He was Secretary of State, right?
Yes,
Pat? Brian
correct.
Kemp was the Secretary of the state of Georgia?
That's exactly right, yeah.
He was both the Republican candidate and overseeing the election itself, voter purges from voter rolls, reduction in voting in polling places, reduction in early voting hours in disproportionately non-white, non-wealthy, Democratic areas, everything under the sun. They just basically threw every voter suppression tactic that they have at Stacey Abrams, including who knows what kind of irregularities in terms of the voting machines themselves. And an investigation is now starting. A whole bunch of materials have been requested by House Democrats in the Oversight Committee from the now Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, from the current Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, documents that are related to the closure, moving, or consolidation of polling sites, details about the voting machines, details about communications related to voter registrations that were placed on hold. I never have super high hopes, Pat, that these investigations will actually get anything overturned. That ship has sort of sailed. But the fact that they're investigating is the right decision, and I hope that they make Brian Kemp's life a living hell while they do it.
Yeah, we did get some good news recently on the topic of voter integrity and election fraud that came out of North Carolina. They're going to completely redo that congressional race, so maybe we could have some luck here. If anything comes out of this, I would love it to be the case that a sitting Secretary of State can't run for another office. I don't know how you would make that change happen. I think it would have to be at the state-by-state level. Every state would have to sign on to it. But that's just the clearest conflict of interest to me. If you have a Secretary of State who's running for governor and he's in charge of certifying his own election, of course that raises concerns. Of course there could be fraud there.
I don't disagree with you, but I think it's really complicated because you might think it's a very clean line. If you're the Secretary of State, then you can't be running. That's the rule. You could make the case that if you're lieutenant governor and you're running for governor, you're also in a position to, in different ways, influence the way that the election is carried out. If you are a county commissioner of some kind, you influence the way that the election is carried out in that particular county. Should you also not be allowed to run for governor? So I totally get the instinct and I understand the conflict of interest and agree that it exists. I just think it is very difficult to actually draw a line cleanly. And I think it would be very easy to claim that the line is blurrier than Secretary of State.
Yeah, when it comes to running for president, there are really only three qualifications. You have to have lived in the U.S. for 14 consecutive years. You have to be born in the U.S. and you have to be over 35. But we talk about how there really should be 10 or 20 other qualifications. Maybe you should have to pass a test and have just a basic understanding of civics. It's really hard to get all that stuff implemented. And I think that applies not only for running for president, also for state offices too. So yeah, it would be an uphill battle. But this is just so glaring.
As far as president, I mean, you need to change the law.
Yeah, oh yeah.
You need to change the law on a lot of those issues related to running for president.
But I feel like when it comes to Secretary of State, you're actually overseeing the election process itself. That's just so glaring to me, and I think there has to be some change there.
Speaking of changes, we've been talking about the atrocious handling of the 2020 census by the Trump administration. 2020 census is massively important. It will be used to determine how the next district lines are drawn for congressional districts. It's used to determine how all sorts of different, very important federal funds are distributed to states and to different districts. I've already given you the very long list of reasons why the 2020 census is extraordinarily important. Donald Trump has been doing all sorts of stuff to either deliberately or just by coincidence sabotage or sabotage, as William Shatner likes to say, the 2020 census. One of these things is not properly funding it. The other is not having appointed a proper director of the census. I don't even know if he has at this point. The position was sitting open for a very long time. And something else that the Trump administration wanted to do with the 2020 census was to add a citizenship question to the census. Now, you might say, what does it matter? Why not add a citizenship question? It's not something that can be used to go and find undocumented immigrants. It's not even clear that it would help people do that. Why even do it? And there's a bunch of different reasons why they may want to do it. One of which is that if you scare off, I guess the word would be, enough immigrants from participating in the census, you are going to shift the balance of population away from states and congressional districts that have more immigrants and just basically commandeer more money from the types of people that I guess Trump would describe as not coming from shithole countries like Norway or whatever. But you can very, very easily see what the intention of that provision would be. The good news is that a federal judge has ruled against the Trump administration. They did this yesterday. They have blocked the Commerce Department from adding the citizenship question to the 2020 census. The statement, the opinion from Judge Richard Seaborg is that the Commerce Department and Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross didn't give any plausible reason as to why you need the question on the census. And that's a really good standard just as a starting point. Just because you want to add it and it's not illegal doesn't mean that you're automatically allowed to, and you have to give a plausible reason for why you want that question on the census. And Wilbur Ross and his legal advisors relied on the idea of the Voting Rights Act to justify including the citizenship question. And the judge found that both arbitrary and capricious, and it would not be allowed, and it's not going to be allowed. And this is, I mean, listen, it's small wins, Pat, but this is a win for sure.
Yeah, and the idea of Republicans citing the Voting Rights Act to make their case is laughable because they've gutted the Voting Rights Act and tried to do away with it altogether. So that doesn't really pass the sniff test for me. I think this is definitely the right move because we want to have an accurate count of people. We want the census to be accurate and people to be forthright. And adding a citizenship question would sacrifice some of that. I think, though, it may be a losing issue for Democrats in a sense, because you have to think for a few seconds why it's a bad idea to put a citizenship question on the census. You have to kind of walk through it. So I think Trump could get up at a podium and say that these Democrats, they're against my immigration reforms. They don't even want it to be so that you have to check off whether you're a citizen or not on the census. And that's unsafe. That's un-American. And I think his audience and maybe even people in the middle will side with him on that issue. So I don't know. I think it's definitely the right ruling, but it's definitely something that we have to educate voters on, I think.
Yeah, Trump's going to frame it as the left doesn't want you to know how many undocumented immigrants there are. Whether that is a plausible explanation or not, and I believe it's not, that's how Trump is going to frame it. But the one area where I sort of disagree is, although that is how Trump would try to frame it, I think that Trump has such bigger problems at this point that he's dealing with that I don't really think that the census is very much on his radar. I don't know. I mean, have you even heard him say anything about it recently at all?
No, but he could adopt that. Like, what if he gives another 2-hour rambling speech like he did at CPAC? I think that could be a topic that gets brought up by him.
Yeah, it's possible. We'll see if the census gets back on Trump's radar. We talked about the case in Arizona where a self-driving Uber vehicle caused the death of a Tempe woman who was struck by the vehicle during a test last year. And an Arizona prosecutor has determined that Uber is not criminally liable. We've been covering this story from the beginning. They put out a statement to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office saying, quote, after a very thorough review of all the evidence presented, this office has determined that there's no basis for criminal liability for the Uber Corporation arising from this matter. This is potentially very, very important because as the situation went down, Elaine Hertzberg, who was 49 years old at the time, was walking a bicycle across the road at night when she was struck and killed by the self-driving Volvo SUV, which was equipped with Uber's self-driving system. And there was a human operator in the car, but at the time, the car was under computer control. And in the 6 seconds before the impact took place, the self-driving system identified the pedestrian as an unknown object, then as a vehicle, then as a bicycle, and a preliminary report from the NTSB explained that even though the system identified that what's called an emergency braking maneuver would have been necessary to prevent the collision, that the system was not set up to activate emergency braking when under computer control. This is a programming issue. And the question around these self-driving cars for years now has been, who is responsible if the system doesn't work right and someone is killed? Is it the programmer of the software? Is it the manufacturer? Would it be, if it's a Honda self-driving car, is it Honda, or is it the company that developed the software that is in the car, which might not be Honda? Is it the individual owner of the vehicle? If you buy a Honda car and as a result of the programming, a Honda self-driving car kills someone, is the person who bought the car responsible? So this is an issue of significant consequence as we continue to move towards self-driving cars. And this decision, Pat, now can serve, it's not a court decision, but it's a prosecutorial decision. It still can build precedent, and the question becomes, who is responsible?
It sounds to me like in this particular instance, the blame should be split up, because it doesn't make sense to me that while under computer's control, that the system wouldn't be activating an emergency brake system if that was necessary. I don't know why that programming decision was made, or maybe something went wrong there. So that portion of it leads me to believe that Uber is somewhat responsible. The driver was apparently watching The Voice, a TV show, while the collision happened, and was only occasionally looking up at the road. There's video evidence of this. So that also makes me think that maybe he's partially liable. Although if you're behind the wheel of an autonomous car, I think it's reasonable to assume that you don't have to always be watching the road, or at least not as often as you would be if you were actually driving it. So yeah, I mean, it's a very complex thing, and precedents will get set by this. The good news is that we'll have much fewer accidents as time goes on, because there will be more autonomous cars on the road, and the robots do a lot better than we humans do at driving.
Well, at some future point, it may not be a requirement that a human operator be sort of monitoring everything that the car is doing and be able to take over. But right now, that actually is what you're supposed to be doing. Right now, these are sort of test provisions, and you are supposed to have a human operator that is paying attention at all times and is ready to take over control. That clearly didn't happen here. And even though it doesn't appear that Uber is going to face criminal liability, civilly, they've already agreed to a settlement with the family of the victim who was tragically killed. Who knows how much money they paid out? I assume it's a lot of money. And that is going to be another question mark sort of as this goes forward. I do think eventually it's going to be figured out in some kind of objective and established way. But for the time being, no pun intended, even though it's Arizona, it's sort of the wild, wild west. And as we talked about on the program a couple of months ago, in an extensive interview with an expert on this, a lot of the testing that's being done is not subject to full disclosure and information about methods and data that are being gathered as a result of the testing that's being done. And that actually should concern all of us. Send me your thoughts if you're still of the mindset that this is simply never going to be a thing. I think at this point, it's pretty clear that we're going in the direction of, at minimum, self-driving cars sharing the road with manually driven cars. How much further than that it will go, I don't yet know. But if you think that there's going to be a reversal and we are going to get away from self-driving cars altogether as a society, I don't agree. I've not seen evidence to suggest that, and I look forward to hearing from you about why.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.